Millionaire CEO invited his black wife to shame her. She returned with twins and silent power. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Naomi Carter once believed silence was simply the absence of sound, but over time, she learned it could also be a form of strength, measured and deliberate, the kind that settled into a room long before anyone noticed. On a cool autumn evening in Manhattan, as the city lights flickered on like distant stars, Naomi stood by the window of her modest apartment, holding an envelope she hadn't expected to see again. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind chosen to signal power before a word was read, and stamped neatly across the front was the name she had trained herself not to react to anymore: Richard Hale. Richard was no longer her husband, but he was still the millionaire CEO whose name moved markets and filled boardrooms, the man who once promised her partnership and instead delivered distance wrapped in polite smiles. The invitation inside was formal, almost courteous, requesting her presence at an exclusive corporate gala, framed as a gesture of closure, a public sign that the past had been handled with maturity and grace. To anyone else, it looked harmless, even generous, but Naomi understood the language of power too well to mistake its tone. This was not an olive branch. It was a stage, carefully lit, where she was expected to play a familiar role. Years earlier, she had entered Richard's world quietly, a woman whose presence was often questioned before her character was known, whose calm was mistaken for compliance, whose dignity was treated like an accessory rather than a foundation. She remembered the long corridors of glass offices, the subtle pauses in conversation when she entered a room, the way assumptions followed her more closely than introductions ever did. When the marriage ended, there were no scenes, no raised voices, only the efficient dismantling of a life that had never fully been allowed to belong to her. Naomi had left with her name intact and her pride unspoken, carrying lessons she never asked to learn. Now, years later, the invitation rested in her hand like a test she had not studied for but already understood. Outside, a taxi horn echoed up the street, and somewhere below, laughter spilled out of a restaurant doorway, life moving forward without ceremony. Naomi exhaled slowly, not in fear, not in anger, but with clarity. She did not need to imagine what awaited her at the gala, the glances, the whispers, the satisfaction of a man convinced that time and money had sealed the narrative in his favor. What mattered was not the invitation itself, but the choice it presented. Naomi placed the card back into the envelope and set it on the table beside her keys, her reflection steady in the darkened glass. She was no longer the woman who needed to explain her presence, and whatever stage Richard Hale had prepared, she would decide how, and if, she would step onto it. Richard Hale had always believed control was a matter of precision, of choosing the right room, the right timing, the right audience, and as the date of the gala approached, everything moved according to plan. His office on the 42nd floor overlooked Midtown like a chessboard, glass and steel arranged beneath him, and from behind his desk he reviewed seating charts and guest lists with the same detached focus he brought to quarterly reports. The event was meant to signal stability, a celebration of growth after a year of aggressive expansion, and quietly, a demonstration that his past no longer carried weight. The invitation sent to Naomi Carter was a final detail, subtle enough to appear gracious, sharp enough to remind everyone where authority rested. In his mind, she would arrive alone, reserved, grateful for the acknowledgement, a reminder of a chapter that had closed neatly under his terms. Around him, assistants spoke in calm voices, discussing lighting, security, and catering choices measured in ounces and dollars, while Richard nodded without looking up, his confidence reinforced by the familiar rhythm of obedience. He remembered Naomi as she had been during the marriage, composed, observant, often silent in rooms where others competed for attention, and he mistook that silence for softness, for acceptance, for a willingness to step aside. What he did not consider was what that silence had carried with it when she left. or what it had allowed her to build beyond his line of sight. Across the city, Naomi moved through her days with a different tempo, one shaped not by board meetings or headlines, but by routines that required presence and patience. Morning light filled her kitchen as she prepared breakfast, the small table crowded with drawings and notebooks, the quiet punctuated by the steady sounds of life continuing. She had learned to measure time differently, not by profit margins, but by moments that mattered, by the weight of responsibility carried without witnesses. When the invitation surfaced again in her thoughts, it did not stir fear or resentment, only resolve. She understood exactly why Richard wanted her there, and exactly what he expected to see, and that clarity freed her from doubt. She reviewed the details carefully, the date, the location, the tone of the message, noting how carefully it avoided apology while pretending courtesy. Naomi did not rush to respond, because urgency belonged to people seeking approval, and she was no longer one of them. Instead, she focused on what she could control, the steady preparation of her own life, the calm consistency that had replaced uncertainty. When she finally placed the envelope back on the table, her decision was already made, not driven by a desire to confront the past, but by a certainty that whatever stage awaited her, she would not enter it as she once had. The city outside continued its restless motion, unaware that two lives were moving toward the same evening with very different understandings of power, and that the silence Naomi carried was no longer empty, but full, measured, and ready. Naomi Carter had learned that the past did not disappear simply because people stopped asking about it. It lingered in details, in habits formed under pressure, in the way she entered rooms without announcing herself. After the marriage ended, she did not make statements or correct assumptions. She packed what she owned into boxes measured in square feet rather than sentiment, and she left Manhattan quietly, choosing distance over confrontation. The city she moved to did not know her history, and that anonymity became a kind of shelter, a place where she could rebuild without being reduced to someone else's narrative. Days settled into routines that demanded focus and patience, mornings that began early and evenings that ended earlier than she once imagined, not because her life had narrowed, but because it had deepened. She discovered a strength that came from consistency, from showing up when no one was watching, from carrying responsibility without applause. When people asked polite questions about her past, she answered with enough truth to satisfy curiosity, but never enough to invite judgment. Over time, the sharp edges of memory softened, not into forgiveness, but into clarity. She remembered the marriage not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in imbalance, in how power can disguise itself as protection and how silence can be mistaken for surrender. There were moments when the weight of what she carried pressed against her chest, when the world felt heavier than it looked, but she met those moments with the same composure that had once unsettled boardrooms. She did not rush decisions, because haste belonged to fear, and she had learned to live without it. Across the years, she built a life measured not in headlines, but in outcomes, not in appearances, but in results that mattered to her alone. The invitation from Richard Hale did not reopen wounds because they had healed correctly, sealed with understanding rather than denial. She saw it for what it was, an attempt to define the past on his terms, to present a version of events that centered his control and minimized her absence. Naomi understood that silence had once protected her, but now it could also speak, if she allowed it. She prepared with intention, not to impress or confront, but to stand firmly in who she had become. She chose what to wear with care, fabrics that moved easily, colors that did not ask for attention yet held it, shoes that reminded her of balance with every step. Each choice reflected a life lived deliberately, a refusal to perform for anyone else's comfort. On the night she confirmed her attendance, she did so without explanation, a simple response sent at the right moment, neither early nor late. The city lights outside her window flickered on as evening arrived, and she watched them with steady eyes, knowing that somewhere, assumptions were being made about her presence, about her purpose, about her place. Naomi did not correct those assumptions, because she no longer needed to. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her, and whatever waited beyond the doors of that gala would meet a woman who understood the quiet authority of standing exactly where she belonged. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in precision and polish, The kind of evening designed to impress before a single word was spoken, and the venue stood like a monument to controlled success, marble floors gleaming beneath chandeliers that scattered light in deliberate patterns. Inside, staff moved with rehearsed efficiency, checking guest lists on tablets, adjusting place settings measured to the inch, ensuring that every glass reflected abundance. Richard Hale arrived early, his tailored suit fitting like certainty, his posture relaxed in the way of a man accustomed to being centered in every room. He greeted investors and executives with practiced warmth, hands firm, smiles calibrated, speaking in full sentences that carried confidence without invitation. Conversations flowed around him about stock performance, expansion plans, and future acquisitions, numbers exchanged in millions and percentages, all reinforcing the narrative he intended to present. To those gathered, this was a celebration of stability, a public reassurance that leadership remained unshaken, that the past had been resolved cleanly. As guests circulated, Richard's attention drifted occasionally toward the entrance, not with anticipation, but with calculation, imagining the moment Naomi Carter would appear as he expected her to, composed but diminished, a visual footnote to his progress. He envisioned polite nods, curious glances, the subtle confirmation that time and power had settled matters in his favor. Around him, laughter rose and fell, glasses clinked, and the soft hum of admiration filled the air, affirming his belief that control was intact. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Naomi prepared without urgency, the evening unfolding with calm intention. She dressed in silence, selecting each piece not to announce arrival, but to honor balance and self-possession, fabric that moved easily, colors that held depth without demand. She checked the time once, then again, not because she was anxious, but because timing mattered, and she had learned the value of entering moments when they were ready to receive her. The drive through the city was smooth, streetlights passing in steady intervals, and she watched reflections shift across the window without attachment, grounded in the present. When she arrived, the building rose before her, familiar in its promise of judgment, yet strangely distant, as though it belonged to a life she had already lived. Inside the venue, whispers traveled ahead of her name, assumptions forming quietly among those who remembered fragments of her story without context. Some expected gratitude, others restraint, a few anticipated discomfort disguised as courtesy. Naomi did not rush to meet those expectations, because she did not carry them. She paused briefly at the entrance, not to gather courage, but to acknowledge the threshold, the point where narratives often tried to define her. The music inside swelled slightly, conversation continuing unaware, and she stepped forward with steady pace, her presence unhurried, unannounced, and unmistakably her own. Across the room, Richard continued speaking, unaware of the shift approaching, confident in the version of events he believed would unfold. The stage was set, the audience prepared, and the assumptions firmly in place, but the silence Naomi carried was no longer passive. It was intentional, measured, and about to challenge every expectation that had been carefully arranged. The shift in the room began subtly, like a change in air pressure before a storm, conversations losing their rhythm as attention drifted toward the entrance without anyone quite realizing why. Naomi Carter stepped fully into the light of the ballroom with a calm that did not ask permission, her posture upright, her movements deliberate, each step measured as if she had already walked this path many times before. She was not alone. On either side of her were two small figures dressed with quiet care, their presence unmistakable and steady, hands resting comfortably in hers, not clinging, not hesitant, but certain. The twins moved with the natural confidence of children who felt protected, their identical expressions curious rather than afraid, eyes taking in the brightness of the room without urgency. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd, not yet words, just a collective intake of breath as assumptions began to strain under new weight. Naomi did not pause for effect. She did not scan the room for approval. She simply continued forward, the soft sound of her steps echoing against marble as the space seemed to widen around her. Heads turned, whispers formed and fell apart, and somewhere near the center of the room, Richard Hale felt the instinctive pull of attention shifting away from him. He turned mid-conversation, his practiced smile still in place, expecting a moment of polite acknowledgement, and instead found his focus locked on a sight that did not fit the outline he had rehearsed. Naomi stood framed by light and movement, composed as ever, but now accompanied by a truth that required no announcement. The twins looked nothing like the projections he had made in his mind, nothing like a strategy or a message. They were simply present, real, undeniable. The room quieted further, the music lowering almost imperceptibly, as guests struggled to reconcile memory with reality. Naomi met no one's gaze for long, not because she avoided it, but because she did not need to hold it. Her attention remained where it belonged, grounded in the small, steady weight of the hand she held, in the responsibility she carried with ease rather than strain. She felt the tension around her without absorbing it, the curiosity, the sudden recalculations, the questions forming behind polite expressions. This was not a confrontation, it was an arrival. The twins glanced up at her briefly, reassured by the calm in her face, then returned their focus to the room, unbothered by the magnitude of the moment unfolding around them. Naomi guided them forward with gentle certainty, navigating the space as if it had been designed for her presence all along. Across the room, Richard stood still, the familiar sense of control slipping into something unfamiliar, something like uncertainty, as he realized that whatever he had intended this evening to be, it was no longer his to define. The silence that followed Naomi's entrance was not empty. It was full, layered with understanding arriving faster than denial could organize itself, and in that silence, power shifted without a single word being spoken. Richard Hale felt the room closing in without a single step being taken toward him, the familiar hum of admiration replaced by a silence that demanded attention he could no longer direct. He studied the twins from a distance that suddenly felt far too short, his mind working through patterns it had always trusted, features aligning in ways he had not anticipated, details he recognized without permission. The curve of a brow, the steady gaze, the unmistakable calm that mirrored something he had once seen reflected back at him in private moments he assumed were forgotten. Naomi stood a few feet away now, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, her expression composed, unreadable, as if she were allowing the truth to arrive on its own terms. She offered no explanation, no introduction, because she did not need to. The twins did not look around for validation. They did not fidget or shrink under the weight of attention. They stood comfortably beside her, secure in a space that was suddenly unsure of itself. Guests shifted their footing, glasses lowered, conversations abandoned mid-thought, as understanding spread unevenly through the room, some quicker to accept it than others. Richard opened his mouth once, then closed it, aware that any question he asked would already carry its answer. The confidence he had cultivated for years began to fracture, not dramatically, but in small, precise ways, the kind that could not be repaired with charm or authority. Naomi met his eyes briefly, not with accusation or triumph, but with clarity, the kind that acknowledged reality without needing to press it further. In that glance, Richard understood what he had missed, not just the existence of the children, but the cost of his assumptions, the way he had reduced silence to absence and composure to compliance. The room seemed to wait, as though expecting a declaration, an explanation, a scene that would justify the tension, but none came. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not shift her stance. She simply allowed the truth to stand where it belonged, fully visible and entirely self-sufficient. Richard felt the weight of every calculated decision he had made settle unevenly, the realization that control could not rewrite what had been built outside his view. The gala he had orchestrated to affirm his authority now reflected something else entirely, a reminder that power without understanding was fragile, and that presence could undo narratives more effectively than confrontation ever could. The twins glanced up at Naomi again, sensing the shift without naming it, and she offered them a small, steady nod, reassurance without spectacle. Around them, the silence held, not uncomfortable, but instructive, revealing more than any announcement might have. Richard straightened slightly, instinct urging him to recover, to say something that would restore balance, but balance had already moved beyond his reach. Naomi turned gently, guiding the twins forward with the same quiet assurance she had carried all evening. leaving Richard where he stood, surrounded by the consequences of an evening that had not unfolded according to plan. The truth had arrived without ceremony, and in its wake, the room understood what Richard was only beginning to grasp, that some power did not need to speak to be heard. The room did not immediately return to its former rhythm after Naomi moved on, because moments like this did not reset easily. They lingered, altering the space they passed through. Guests attempted to resume conversations, but voices sounded lower, careful, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had just occurred. Richard Hale remained where he was, his posture unchanged, yet something essential had shifted beneath the tailored fabric of his confidence. He felt eyes on him, not accusatory, but curious, measuring, recalibrating the narrative they had accepted moments earlier. For the first time that evening, he became aware of how quiet the room had grown around him, how the attention he once commanded now carried a different weight. The event was still technically his name still adorned the programs, his achievements still listed in polished language, but the certainty those symbols once provided no longer held. He excused himself from a nearby conversation with a nod that felt automatic, moving toward a quieter edge of the room where reflections from the glass walls blurred the city lights beyond. In that space, removed from performance, memory returned with unexpected clarity. He remembered moments he had dismissed, the way Naomi listened without interruption, the steadiness of her presence in rooms where others competed for dominance, the composure he had mistaken for compliance. He realized how easily he had believed that silence meant agreement, that absence meant erasure, and how convenient those beliefs had been. Across the ballroom, Naomi guided the twins with ease, responding to their quiet questions with gentle assurance, her attention fixed where it had always belonged. She did not glance back, not out of indifference, but because she had nothing left to prove in that direction. The twins remained calm, their curiosity satisfied not by the grandeur around them, but by the steadiness they trusted. Richard watched from a distance that felt larger than it had any right to be, aware that whatever he felt now could not alter what had already been revealed. He considered approaching her, rehearsing words that might acknowledge reality, that might bridge the silence he once controlled, but each version fell short before it could form. Any attempt to speak would center him again, and this moment did not belong to him. Around him, subtle shifts continued, investors exchanged looks, executives noted reactions, and the story of the evening began rewriting itself without his input. He understood then that authority could be disrupted not by confrontation, but by truth standing quietly where it was not expected. The realization did not arrive with drama. It settled gradually, like a weight redistributing itself across his shoulders. He straightened, not to reclaim control, but to regain composure, recognizing the difference for the first time. Naomi's presence had not diminished him. It had revealed the limits of what he had relied on. As the gala moved forward, its polished surface intact but altered beneath, Richard remained aware that something irreversible had occurred, not publicly announced, not loudly confirmed, but clearly understood. The silence she carried had done what no argument could. It had exposed the cost of his assumptions and left him facing a truth that would not retreat simply because the evening continued. And in that understanding, the collapse was not visible to everyone, but it was complete where it mattered most. The evening drew toward its formal close with the kind of elegance that could not fully conceal what had shifted beneath it, and as guests began to depart, the ballroom slowly emptied of its earlier tension, leaving behind a quieter, more reflective air. Naomi Carter moved through the space with the twins at her side, acknowledging polite gestures with measured courtesy, accepting no questions and offering no explanations, because none were required. Her presence had already communicated everything she intended, and she felt no urge to linger beyond that truth. Outside, the city greeted them with familiar sounds, traffic flowing in steady patterns, lights stretching down avenues like lines drawn with purpose. She guided the twins into the waiting car, fastening seat belts with practiced care, her movements calm and efficient,